Hi, it's Gary. Welcome to today's video. Well, lately we've all been hearing about these high rates of inflation that are going on around the whole world. Now, I've always known there's been inflation there, but to be honest, I've never really thought about what it is and what the impact is. Inflation, it can be defined as the general increase in the price of goods and services, and also the decrease in the purchasing power of money within the economy. So what does this mean? I mean, it sounds really posh, doesn't it? Well, it's simple. It means you have to pay more to get the same things. But if the amount of money you have doesn't increase as well, it also means that you can't buy as much as you used to. Now let's take a closer look at inflation. Economists, they say that there should be a small rate of inflation. They say it's actually a good thing. It's an indicator of a healthy economy which encourages employment and reduces the economic impact of any recessions. It also encourages people to invest and spend rather than hoarding their money, rather than saving all their money. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to inflation. The advantages, well, it can lead to a higher resale value for assets, so you can get more for what you're trying to sell. And optimum levels of inflation, well, they're there to encourage people to spend money. The disadvantages, though, buyers have to pay more for products or services. Prices in the economy, they're higher. It also drives up the prices of some items now, but those items, they used to make something else. So later on, they go up. So the inflation adds up and adds up over a long term as well. If inflation goes too high, then it can start to have a major impact on the economy. We've got an example here. If we look in 2018 in Venezuela, they had an inflation rate of 1,000,000% per month. This is referred to as hyperinflation, and yes, it does happen in economies every now and again. In Venezuela, this high level of inflation, it caused the entire economy to collapse. And this is an extreme example, but it's just there as an example. Most countries, they've set a target inflation rate of about 2%. That's seen as like a nice steady growth that encourages growth for the economy. It is a gentle increase in prices, and as the prices are going up, so are people's incomes. Most countries, they have central banks, and these central banks, they're tasked with keeping inflation around this 2% target. The main way they do this is by adjusting interest rates. So essentially, if they increase the interest rate, it makes it cost more to borrow money. And the idea is if inflation goes up, increase the interest rate, and then you try to reduce the inflation because it costs more to lend the money so people don't spend as much. The aim, it's all about trying to reduce spending, and that reduces the demands for goods and services, and then eventually it reduces the prices as well. There are three general ways in which inflation comes about. The first one is called the demand pull effect. This is where the cost of credit is low, so people have got more access to money to buy things with. It means that leads to a lot of demand for items. The result of this is, yes, there's a high demand, but if the companies making the products, if the companies providing the services, if they aren't able to supply enough to meet that demand, it means they can put the prices up. The increase in prices, that leads to an increase in inflation. Another way prices can go up is by the cost push effect. It's an increase in the cost to make things. Really good example of this at the moment is fuel. Virtually everything requires fuel. It could be to transport goods around, it could be to generate the electric, to power the factories, to power the homes. But this means that the cost to build and transport items, they increase. And because companies have to pay more to build them, they want to get more money for it, so they have to increase the price to cover that extra cost. The result? Well, prices go up, inflation goes up. The third effect, this is called built-in inflation. And it's where everybody assumes that inflation is going to go up, so we try to make sure that we've got sufficient money coming in to cover that. A good example here is wages. We assume that prices are going to go up. When we come to negotiate our pay, well, we ask for higher wages. As a result of this, companies, their wage bill goes up. They have to increase their prices to cover the extra wages. The result, inflation goes up. So those are the three effects that can affect inflation. But how do we actually calculate that inflation rate? This is something I've really liked digging into. I found this one really interesting. Most countries, they use a measure called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This is calculated based on what they call a basket, which is a wide range of goods and services that a normal household would buy. The contents of these baskets, they do change over time, but most countries, they try and change them only once a year, sometimes not even as frequently as that. The inflation rate, well, it's then worked out by looking at how much that basket would cost this year as opposed to how much that same basket cost last year. Now the rate is calculated doing some very simple maths. Let's take a look at it. So what we say is the inflation rate, it's today's cost minus last year's cost. So that's the increase in price, divided by last year's cost, and then multiply it all by 100. We do that so we can get the percent. Let's look at an example. Last year, the cost was $65,321. This year, the cost is $72,458. Let's start replacing these terms in the maths. First, let's go and put the numbers in. So what we've got is we have 72,458 minus 65,321. We divide the result of that by 65,321 and multiply it all by 100. Let's do that subtraction. So that now gives us 7,137. That's how much the prices have increased over the year. Divide that by the cost of the basket at the start of the year, so that's 65,321, multiply by 100, and that gives us the calculation. The result of this is an inflation rate of 10.92%. Remember, this is only an example. I wanted to do the maths just so we can see how it's worked out. So what's that basket made up of? Well, it's made up of a group of different product items, and it gets really complicated how it does this. But the idea is you get things that people would eat, so you might put all the food together, you might put cost of housing, so that might be mortgages, that might be rent, various different items which they call groups. Each country, they've got their own groups, and as I've already said, these groups, they're reviewed every year. The stats people, they look at these groups and then they look at the normal spending of a normal household and they work out, well, what percentage does each group take up of that total amount spent? And that's called a weighting. An example basket here is from Australia, and this is from the 2021 calculations. So when they looked at this, they found that housing, that's 23%. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, 17%. Recreation and culture, 9%. Transport, 11%. Furnishing and stuff for the house, 9%. Alcohol and tobacco, 9%. Health, 7%. Education, 5%. Clothing and footwear, 3%. Communications, 2%. Yes, I know this adds up to a little bit more than 100, but that's because we've rounded down to get the whole numbers for the percentages. So if we take a look at the housing costs, according to this, it makes up 23% of the inflation rate. Let's look through an example. We're going to assume that inflation is just made up from two groups. It's just to make the maths easy. Food is 77% of the spending, and it's got an increase of 3.4% for that group. Housing, 23% of the spending, and that's increased by 5.4%. So to work out the increase, what we need to do is take the rate of inflation for each group, then multiply it by the weighting, and that then gives the contribution to the entire overall inflation rate. Again, we do this with another simple calculation. For us, This is the food weight multiplied by the food increase. We add to that the housing weight multiplied by the housing increase. One little trick here, we do divide the weight by 100 just to make the maths a little bit easier. So let's put the numbers in. With our example, we've got 0.77, which is the food weight, times 3.4, which is the food increase. We add to that 0.23, which is the weight for the housing, times 5.4. Working out each bracket, that gives us 2.618 plus 1.242. So that's the contribution of each group to the total rate. And the total rate this gives us is 3.86%. Now this is just at a high level at the top groups. Underneath those groups, they're broken down into smaller groupings, and a similar process is used to calculate the rate for each of these smaller groups. And it goes all the way down till it gets to the individual items that are actually bought. It's easy to see how it can be quite difficult to work out the inflation rate. I mean, we're talking thousands of products in these baskets, and all of these are built in, and then we need to apply the maths and then add it all up as we're going. Now, we've talked about what inflation is. Let's talk about why it's so high at the moment. Here, I'm going to try and simplify the causes. There's lots of different things impacting the inflation rate, but we're just going to focus on two. The first thing is COVID-19. And I know, doesn't everything seem to be related to COVID-19 at the moment? During the pandemic, two big things happened. The first, a lot of factories, they either shut down or they started to work at a lower level. They decreased production. What this meant is there weren't as many items being produced. The supply was reduced. But demand, this is people wanting to buy the products, that didn't reduce, that stayed the same. Because we had a reduced supply for the same demand, that meant prices, they could go up because people would pay it. And prices did go up. Now, yes, now factories, they're starting to come back online, they're starting to work at higher levels, but we're still not at the level that it was at the start of the pandemic. So the demand is still the same, the supply is still reduced, prices still going up. The second thing is, a lot of governments, they provided stimulus cash to try and encourage people to spend, to invest in the economy. That extra cash, it meant people could buy more. That increased demand. When you combine this increased demand with reduced supply, there's only one thing can happen. Prices went up. The other big factor to do with the increase in inflation at the moment is down to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The first, a lot of countries placed sanctions on Russia. Now, Russia, it's one of the world's biggest suppliers of oil and gas. Now, that oil and gas, it's need to generate fuel, it's need to generate energy. Because Russia was cut off from selling these, the demand for oil and gas stayed the same, but the supply, we got rid of Russia's supply, the supply vastly reduced. What this led to is the price for oil and gas to increase. And this means the cost for fuel and energy also increased. That's where we've got the cost push effect coming in. The price went up. The second impact, this was to do with the supply of grain to the world. Ukraine, it produces a lot of grain. And this normally it would be exported to the rest of the world. It's currently not being exported. The result, similar to what we've got with oil and gas. The demand for grain has not reduced. The supply of grain greatly reduced. The result, increased costs. This led to increased prices, and that led to increased inflation. Now, I know this video has been quite long. The key message though is inflation, it's nothing new. Central banks, they've got experience in controlling inflation levels. And they're doing that at the moment. We're seeing interest rates going up. We see the banks doing everything they can to try and fetch down the current rates of inflation. Most countries, they want the inflation rate down. They want it about 2%. All this work, it's not going to happen overnight. But governments, central banks are working very hard to try and bring down the rate of inflation. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I've really enjoyed doing the research for this one. As said at the start, I've known about inflation, but being able to dig into it and get a little bit more information, especially about how the inflation rate is generated, I found that really interesting. What are your thoughts? What do you want to know more about inflation? I'm thinking of doing a follow-up video, maybe in a few weeks, of looking at the cost of living. And I'd be really interested. What are the sort of things you'd like me to cover? Please drop that comment, let me know. Then I can start looking into it. Please hit the thumbs up button. Every time you like, every time you comment, just helps with the YouTube algorithm. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so that you can get new videos as I release them. I'll talk to you again soon.